है दिल है मुश्किल जीना यहाँ, जरा हटके जरा बच के, ये है बम्बई मेरी जान। कहीं बिल्डिंग, कहीं ड्रामे, कहीं मोटर, कहीं मिल, मिलता है यहाँ सब कुछ, बस मिलता नहीं दिल. So what is, I think, central to this search for community is this dil. Since we are here to talk about the larger urban reimagination, not just Bombay, though we are all a little bit more in love with Bombay, we forget that this is a very old problem. It's a pre-modern problem, or not a problem, but a very ancient syndrome. I don't know how many of you are aware that in the Ramayana, when Ram is exiled, he's actually quite delighted. And when they try to persuade him to come back, his point is that, no, but I'm quite thrilled about spending 14 years in the wilderness. Because in the Indian context, the wilderness is a place of solitude, self-discovery, reflection. And that's why, in fact, our centers of knowledge and learning and deeper wisdom have always been located in the wilderness. I've always found it interesting that Krishna also is born in Mathura but grows up in a non-urban context. But I want to take us away from these Indian examples because I want to actually focus on the third stanza of this song, and then and just to share two stories with you. Will you do the timekeeping? I'm very bad with timekeeping. Okay. This song, by the way, is written by Janisar Akhtar, who is Javed Akhtar's Walid Sahab. Khud kaate gale sabke, kahe isko business. That's the third stanza of the song. And I'm going to try and convey the struggle that we are in the midst of through two stories about two different kinds of walls. On the 9th of September, really freaky, 9th of September, 1609, the first white man landed in Manhattan. His name was Henry Hudson. And within about 25 years, there was enough of a settlement on the south end of that island that the European community that settled there had to build a wall, because by then they had lost their friendship with the locals, and there was a war between them and the Delaware people, and so they built a barricade to protect themselves. And of course, as we know the history, everybody knows the local people were eventually decimated within about 40 years, 50 years, and in the late 17th century, that wall was pulled down, that barricade was pulled down, and a street was built exactly where the wall stood. And that's Wall Street. It's still known as Wall Street to commemorate that barricade. Wall Street has meant many things to many people over the last century, but what is important to our context here today is that it is both a physical location for and a metaphorical representation of the market. And my submission to you is that the market is very different from bazaars and marketplaces, which are ancient. The earliest market exchange, that is marketplace exchanges, are about 3,000 years old, roughly. Though the earliest fixed retail shops are only they date back to about 600 BC. But some form of market exchange, rather marketplace exchange, and we don't have time to go into the distinctions, and I won't bore you with them, is very ancient. But what happens over the last 200 years, and that is what Wall Street becomes a fulcrum for from the 1800s onwards, is a very deliberate separation between our engagement with the marketplace and our life as citizens and as members of communities. And gradually, we get the world that we live in today, where we have to go into the marketplace and behave as completely different creatures who are legally bound. If you're a CEO, you are legally bound to give top priority only to the fiduciary responsibilities that you hold. And you can actually be sued if you compromise those fiduciary responsibilities to show communitarian concerns. So that separation of the rest of society from the marketplace is a roughly 200-year-long process. And in some sense, therefore, it's a very fitting irony that its most pivotal location is actually called Wall Street. The second wall that I want to talk about is a very different kind, and actually that is what hopefully breaking it down is going to change our future. And yet there's an interesting parallel between the two stories. Richard Stallman started working at the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT in the late 60s, early 70s. He was a Harvard undergraduate, and so he was part of the Artificial Intelligence Lab community through the 70s. And he grew up, that is intellectually, he grew up in a community of software engineers. And they were a community in a very, very basic sense that we use the word community, giving and taking, sharing, being part of a sense of fellow feeling, belonging. In the late 70s, early 80s, something very dramatic changed in this community with the introduction of proprietary software. And suddenly, as Richard Stallman says in his memoir, I was told that even looking over the shoulder of my colleague and borrowing software or sharing software with him was now illegal. And everywhere, these proprietary walls were being created because, of course, what was happening at the time was that the desktop had been born. And the desktop world created an entire new industry. So in that sense, Richard Stallman's career has run parallel with that of Bill Gates. Now, Stallman says he had three options. He could either forget about these concerns and swallow them down and continue doing software in the proprietary mode. I mean, not continue, sorry, begin to do software work in the proprietary mode and feel pretty rotten about his life at the end of it. The second option, he says, was to join some of the members of his community who were doing protests. They were standing outside proprietary companies and doing halla bol. The third option was, he said, to start a community that would bring the community together to do what they really wanted to do. Rather than protesting, rather than opposing what they felt was wrong, to just create what they thought was necessary to do. And then he did something which has secured his place in history. Richard Stallman, I'm told, he's a man with few friends, but even the people who hate his guts say that this man, somebody should have built a statue to this man for this one thing he did, and that's known as the General Public License. Now, the General Public License was a legal institution that institutionalized a concept that by then they had called copyleft. The copyleft is the opposite of copyright. But why is it necessary? It's necessary because they do want to acknowledge, they believe that to acknowledge that something is your creation is important. That it should, it's not that they are dissolving the concept of theft. If I create something, or rather if you create something and I show it as my own, that is theft. So the GPL protects the origins of the work. It also therefore protects it from being stolen by somebody who will then turn it into the proprietary domain. Oh, I'm sorry, I've run ahead because I've assumed that everybody knows what this is about. What is it about? It's about the code of the computer software. It's not that you can't sell something that you've designed, but that you must sell it with the code. And it's like the difference between just selling something that you've cooked and keeping the recipe secret. And then not only keeping it secret, but registering it in a patent system that allows you to go and criminally prosecute somebody who makes the same recipe. So the GPL then became the legal fulcrum which protected the creativity of software engineers who chose to be in the open source mode. Well, Richard's preferred term is free software. Later, the term was changed by some to open source because free software had very anti-business connotations. And this is not about being anti-business. And the rest is history. In the 90s, the GPL was begun in 85? 87. In 1990, a young boy hacking away at his computer at the University of Helsinki created the kernel of something that today runs 90% of the internet. It's called Linux, or Linux as we call it in India. His name is Linus Torvalds. And I have two favorite Linus quotes. One is, he's often asked, buddy, what have you got against making money? He says, absolutely nothing. It's just not what gives me a kick in life. And he says, in any case, I have enough to put gas in my BMW. So I'm not doing too badly. And the other, of course, absolute icon of this world. And the reason I'm telling you about Linus and now Tim Berners-Lee is that Stallman's is not an individual story alone. Stallman was at the head of a wave. And Tim Berners-Lee is the man who gave us the World Wide Web, which, by the way, turned 20 last month. It was 20 years old last month that the World Wide Web first went live on Tim Berners-Lee's computer at the CERN Institute in Switzerland. And I would strongly urge you all to look up. If you just Google Tim Berners-Lee, November 2010, I think you should be able to find it. He has written a very frightening article in Scientific American, which says that precisely what he created the World Wide Web for, which is community. And he said, it's very interesting. He has fundamentally ethical and moral convictions, but he puts them in a very practical and pragmatic way. He says it was a very pragmatic problem. If I had created a Berners-Lee web, then it wouldn't be a World Wide Web, because then there would have been implicitly room for a Hewlett-Packard web and a Microsoft web and an Intel web. It wouldn't be a World Wide Web. And I'm not able to explain because I've not understood what the technicalities are, but this is what he's saying, that today the web is the freedom of the web. Its fundamentally communitarian nature is in danger because the very companies, the very phenomenon that have become giants on the basis of the freedom of the web are now creating walls that endanger the future of the web. It is in this larger context that I would urge that we need to consider the question of communities globally. And it's not just to be about cities, because when we say that, now there are some projections that in another 40 years, 60 or 70% of humanity is going to live in cities. I think that rural-urban divide is vanishing very fast. What is going to be central is that what are the systems that enable us to and allow us, well, firstly just allow, because then further facilitation is dur ki baat, to live in a communitarian mode. And you will forgive me for being a little sort of simplistic here, because of course the truth is that all of us, well, most of us tend to live simultaneously in all of these modes. Parts of us exist in all of these modes, but there are times when we are asked to make choices. And sometimes in the rush of life, I think we miss those opportunities and the choices are made for us. The choices are between those modes of work, profit-making, and enterprise that will nurture larger democratic spaces and communitarian spaces, and those that will create walls. Now, those that create walls in the old model, in the 20th century model, that was the only way to make profits. The big hope today is that those models are collapsing, and most technological breakthroughs are actually moving us in the communitarian direction. It is the 20th century mindset that is trying to create the walls that will make it harder and harder for those communitarian technologies to fulfill their promise. So two of the examples that Tim Berners-Lee refers to in this Scientific American article he wrote in November are these, that both in France and in England there are now laws which make it legal for the internet service provider to be monitoring the sites that you go on, and if your name shows up on a suspect list, just a suspect list, that is of people who are downloading stuff that is quote unquote illegal to download, that is in any way an infringement of somebody's copyright, without due process, your internet connection can be cut without redressal. And his argument is that today access to the internet is a fundamental democratic right. And any government that empowers the denial of that right, if you're allowed, any entity is allowed to deny you that right without due process, this is a fundamental violation of democratic rights. There's also a very interesting book out that I would urge everyone to look at, because these larger struggles for the commons are going to define our material and our social world. It's For the Common Good by Lewis Hyde. And he's looked very seriously at the kind of mindset that is being systematically cultivated to project a 20th century version of copyrights and patents as not only appropriate, but as basic and as mother's milk as the Human Rights Declaration. It has some frightening stories about how entire school curriculum are being reoriented to project what is actually a very particular and really questionable regime of copyrights as, in fact, a kind of gospel truth. So I'll close on that, but on a slightly, I hate to close on a negative note. That's not usually my, what I like to do, by actually reminding us of the last line of the same song, which, goes to, I think, Asha Bhosle. No, it's Geeta Dutt. वो कहती है कि, because the woman disagrees with him. Remember, he's saying कि हटके बचके कोई यहाँ दिल नहीं है, कोई जान नहीं है. She says, नहीं, बुरा दुनिया वो है कहता, ऐसा भोला तो न बन, जो है करता वो है भरता, है यहाँ का ये चलन. So, in a sense, one has to live with that faith. And I do, and so really, I don't want to make it sound like, doom is waiting outside the door on these issues, but it does need a lot of action from all of us to protect the communities. Thank you.